The Prince and Princess of Wales, their 3 children, all greeting well-wishers. 7-year-old Prince Louis breaking protocol and snatching some chocolates given to his father.
We had ours closely watching the royal kiddos. Prince Louis once again totally stealing the show.
Prince Louis was quietly sitting at Windsor Castle when a famous pianist leaned over and jokingly asked him to play the piano. What happened next left everyone in the room completely stunned, creating a moment no one would ever forget. The room fell silent as the pianist smiled, not the warm, gentle kind of smile given to children, but the thin, amused one that usually precedes a joke at someone else's expense. 7-year-old Prince Louis didn't fully understand what was happening. All he knew was that every adult in the room was suddenly watching him, and something inside his chest tightened. To the world, he was known for his playful waves and silly faces, yet in that instant, all attention was fixed solely on him. Prince Louis was known for his playful waves, silly faces, and the way he could never seem to stand still, capturing cameras' attention with his unpredictable energy, while commentators dismissed him as cheeky and full of life. But no one ever asked why that energy existed in the first place. That day at Windsor Castle, a supposedly simple royal afternoon was unfolding, a carefully planned event where important guests sipped tea, admired the palace, and left with good stories. Among them was a world-famous pianist, celebrated for his technical precision, sold-out halls, and sharp opinions. To him, music was a locked gate, accessible only to those deemed worthy. Art demanded discipline, sacrifice, and perfection, leaving little room for childish noise. Prince Louis had been brought into the room, as royal children often are, briefly, politely, and just long enough to be seen. William stood nearby speaking with patrons while Catherine offered Louis a reassuring motherly look, sensing he was already overwhelmed. The young prince shifted from foot to foot in the grand but cold room, with its high ceilings, tall windows, and imposing walls, unaware that the pianist's joking challenge would soon set the stage for an unforgettable moment. The room, lined with portraits of ancestors who seemed to stare straight through him, made Louis uncomfortable. He hated spaces that demanded stillness in a way his body didn't understand. Yet the pianist noticed him almost immediately. "Ah, this must be the lively one," he said, tilting his head slightly. A few guests chuckled softly, and Louis smiled, something he had learned to do when adults laughed, as it usually made situations easier. The pianist's gaze then drifted to the polished grand piano in the corner, more decorative than functional, its lid closed and keys untouched. Does he play?" The pianist asked casually, though a trace of amusement lingered in his tone. "Not formally, since he's still quite young," William replied before Louis could. The pianist nodded, turning back to Louis with a sly grin. "Shame," he said. "Such small hands. But I suppose every royal child thinks they can play before they understand what music actually demands." The adults around them exchanged quiet smiles, unaware that the pianist's playful remark was about to spark an unforgettable moment. The adults laughed again, a little louder this time. Louis didn't laugh. He didn't fully understand the words, but he felt the tone in the same way children sense rain before it falls. Then the pianist did something no one expected. "Well," he said, gesturing toward the piano, "why don't we hear something? Go on, young prince, and show us what you've got." His words sounded playful, light-hearted, almost kind, but they weren't. The room stilled, and every eye turned to Louis. His face grew warm as he looked first at his mother, then at his father. No one stepped in, unaware that to Louis, this did not feel like a game. He shook his head slightly and said, "I don't, but the pianist don't be shy." But that was the joke, subtle enough to leave Louis. No escape, not cruel enough to protest, not obvious enough to stop, yet enough to put a child squarely in the spotlight and wait for him to fail. Touching the pages she had once turned made him feel less alone. He wasn't just a boy playing a forgotten piano. He was a grandson reclaiming a family legacy that the world had long forgotten. Days turned into weeks after that incident, and Louis's practice sessions grew more frequent and focused. While most people still saw him as the playful, unpredictable prince, while the world still saw him as a playful, energetic prince who made silly faces on the balcony, something was quietly changing beneath the surface. Louis was learning discipline and patience, discovering that music gave him a voice words never could. The pianist's dismissive words, "Children are better suited to waving than playing," lingered in his mind. fueling his determination. Whenever he felt like giving up, he remembered that afternoon and how small and useless he had felt in that room full of adults. He began spending more time in the palace library, poring over sheet music and studying musical theory. His parents started to notice a change. He seems different lately, William said to Catherine one evening. There's something more settled about him. Catherine agreed, unaware that their youngest son was dedicating hours at the old piano, teaching himself with a seriousness that would have surprised anyone who knew him only from public appearances. One rainy afternoon, Louis practiced longer than usual. The sound of raindrops tapping the windows blended with the notes he played, and for the first time he felt he was truly making music, not just pressing keys. By the time Louis stopped, his fingers were sore, but he felt something new, a deep sense of accomplishment that came from working hard at something meaningful. He wasn't trying to keep his practice a secret exactly, but he wasn't advertising it either. This was his own world, a part of his life where he didn't have to perform for cameras or meet anyone's expectations. He was simply a little boy learning to play the piano because he wanted to. Then something happened that changed everything. King Charles mentioned that the family had received an invitation to the International Harmony Gala, a prestigious classical music event featuring some of the biggest names in the world, including the pianist who had dismissed Louis weeks earlier. When Louis heard this, something stirred inside him. The gala was still weeks away, but he sensed it might be his chance to show that he was more than what people assumed. Catherine noticed her son's reaction. "It will be a long evening," she said gently, "and very formal. Do you think you'll manage?" Louis nodded, saying he would be fine, though his heart raced. He didn't plan to cause a scene or draw attention to himself, but he knew he had changed since that afternoon when he had been humiliated. Even as a small child, he felt a quiet determination stirring within him. Louis understood what humiliation meant for a royal. If people saw him as weak once, they might never see him as strong again. Everyone expected royal children to be perfect, smart, polite, and talented at everything they did. Because he hadn't been able to defend himself when the pianist mocked him, Louis felt as if he had lost his dignity. Now, the only way to reclaim it was to prove he was better than they thought, to change his image before the world decided who he was. As the gala approached, he practiced with renewed focus. The secret he had been nurturing, the skill he had been developing in private, was about to be tested in ways he couldn't yet imagine. And as the date drew nearer, he began to realize this might be his chance to prove something not just to the pianist who had mocked him, but to himself. The invitation wasn't for just any event, it was for an evening at the Royal Albert Hall, the famous red brick building with a domed glass roof in the heart of London that looked almost like a giant crown. The family traveled from Windsor to London for the night. Louis sat quietly in the car, watching the city lights grow brighter as they approached. This wasn't the royal variety performance with its loud music and colorful lights. This was the International Harmony Gala, a serious once-a-year gathering where every note mattered, an evening where musicians performed not just to entertain, but to be remembered. From the moment they arrived, the night felt heavy. The Royal Albert Hall had hosted countless events before, yet this one carried a different kind of pressure. It wasn't merely another gathering, it was a celebration of classical music, tradition, and excellence. The people invited were those whose opinions truly mattered in that world. Critics, patrons, composers, donors, and performers filled the grand halls. Every movement seemed rehearsed even before the music began. The staff moved with careful precision as guests arrived in formal attire, while the soft murmur of polite conversation floated through the corridors. Gentle string music played in the background, and the famous dome above reflected warm light onto the polished floors. Everything was designed to feel elegant and controlled, leaving no room for surprises. At least, that's what everyone believed. Prince Louis walked in with his family, dressed neatly and holding himself exactly as he had been taught. For him, stepping through those massive doors meant stepping into the gala. Louis entered a world where everything had to be perfect. He looked small among the tall figures in dark suits, yet every eye seemed to find him. He stayed close to Catherine, who kept her expression calm but watched him closely, knowing how overwhelming rooms like this could feel, especially after what had happened weeks earlier. The pianist was already there, near the center of the room, surrounded by admirers and fellow musicians. His posture was confident and his voice carried easily as he spoke about music and performance. To many, he was a symbol of mastery and discipline, capable of opening doors with a nod or closing them just as quietly. He was scheduled to perform that night as part of the gala program, and his presence alone had raised expectations. But when his eyes passed over Prince Louis, there was a brief, subtle pause. He remembered the boy, the quiet embarrassment that had followed his joke at Windsor Castle. To the pianist, it had seemed insignificant, just a moment of amusement. After all, children forgot things the pianist assumed children forgot quickly, and this one would be no different. He expected nothing from Louis, if anything. He anticipated discomfort or avoidance, perhaps the restless energy the cameras always captured. Confidence, talent, these were far from his expectations. In his mind, that chapter was closed. As guests were guided to the main hall, the atmosphere shifted. The performance space had been prepared with meticulous care. Rows of chairs faced the stage where a grand piano rested under soft lights. Programs were handed out, and conversations gradually faded as people took their seats. Prince Louis sat between his parents, his feet barely touching the floor. He swung them slightly before remembering where he was, folding his hands in his lap. His face appeared calm, but his chest felt tight. The room seemed larger than ever, and the hush of the audience made him nervous. Behind the scenes, the pianist prepared himself, known for his control, yet something unsettled him that night, perhaps the formality of the space and the knowledge that this performance would be judged by those whose opinions shaped careers. No matter how many times you've seen the world, a room this big could still make your hands shake. He ran through the opening passages in his mind, already imagining the applause that would follow. The pianist wasn't thinking about Prince Louis. To him, the boy was just a small part of a long day. It wasn't anger, he simply didn't believe a child could understand the kind of pressure he felt. In his mind, children were there to enjoy the show, not to truly feel the weight of the music. The program began smoothly, with a brief introduction explaining the gala's purpose, supporting classical music education and preservation, inspiring future generations, and honoring those who had already achieved greatness. The words were practiced and polite, and the audience listened attentively. Then the pianist took the stage. The applause was respectful and measured, which he acknowledged with a slight nod. He sat at the piano, adjusted his posture, and placed his hands on the keys. The room fell completely silent. This was his domain, and everyone knew it. But something went wrong, not visibly at first, not enough for the audience to notice immediately. His fingers moved. Yet the confidence he usually felt, the confidence did not arrive. A minor mistake crept in early, small enough to be forgiven, yet large enough for him and the other professionals to feel it. His focus tightened, and instead of relaxing into the music, he began to push against it. From the audience, Prince Louis listened closely. He didn't understand every technical detail of the piece, but he understood sound and feeling. He noticed the tension in the pianist's face and the slight hesitation in his movements, and without realizing it, he leaned forward, absorbed in the music and trying to learn from everything he saw. The pianist continued, but the performance was not unfolding as he had expected. The room sensed it too. The energy shifted not into discomfort, but into quiet awareness. It wasn't a failure. The performance was good, very good, but it wasn't the excellence everyone had anticipated. When the piece ended, the applause was polite and supportive, yet restrained. The pianist stood and acknowledged it, though his jaw tightened briefly before he returned to his seat. He knew something had slipped through his grasp, and he needed to regain control. The evening wasn't over. As the program continued, a subtle adjustment was discussed behind the scenes. A short pause settled over the room, and the host returned to the stage to announce a brief transition. That was when attention returned to the stage once more. Attention drifted back to the audience as Prince Louis shifted in his seat. He felt eyes on him again, though he couldn't say why. Someone near the aisle glanced his way, then another, and a faint murmur rippled through a small section of the room before settling. The idea wasn't planned or announced. It emerged from circumstance, tension, and the pianist's need to regain control of the evening. He stood once more, his tone light enough to mask irritation, and gestured toward the front rows. Oh. Half-jokingly, he suggested that the gala was about inspiring the next generation and that perhaps a young royal guest might enjoy sitting closer to the piano. The room reacted before anyone had time to think. Catherine's hand tightened briefly, and William leaned forward, uncertain. There was no clear refusal or agreement, just a moment that moved too quickly. A staff member stepped forward and gently guided Louis toward the aisle. He stood and walked toward the stage, each step making his heart beat louder as he felt the room watching him with curiosity rather than warmth. When he reached the edge of the stage, he stopped, unsure of what was expected. The pianist looked down at him, and from that angle Louis seemed even smaller. The pianist assumed the moment would pass easily. A child couldn't disrupt the evening, and whatever followed would only reinforce the difference between discipline and play. Louis placed his hands at his sides, his fingers tingling, the piano only a few steps away as the room waited. Just before anyone could intervene, before anyone fully understood what was unfolding, Prince Louis took a small step forward and lifted his gaze toward the instrument that had once been used to make him feel small. The room fell into complete silence as everyone watched. He didn't move quickly, advancing instead with the careful pace he used when entering unfamiliar rooms, as if testing the ground beneath him. A staff member hesitated near the edge of the stage, then stopped. No instructions were given, and no one knew what protocol applied when a child approached a grand piano in the middle of an international gala. Catherine shifted in her seat but did not stand, while William leaned forward slightly, his focus fixed on his son. Louis reached the piano bench and paused. Up close, the instrument looked enormous, its polished surface reflecting the stage lights and its keys stretching farther than he was used to. Her scissor? He adjusted the bench with both hands, the soft scrape echoing through the hall, then climbed up and sat with his feet dangling just above the floor. The pianist watched closely, expecting hesitation or nervous uncertainty, but instead saw something that made him straighten. Louis did not rush. He waited, hands hovering above the keys, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then he played. The first note was soft but carried weight, moving cleanly and steadily through the hall. A second note followed. Then a third, measured, intentional, just as he had practiced. A quiet ripple passed through the audience as programs lowered and heads leaned forward. This was not noise, and it was not a joke. It was a child placing notes with purpose in a room full of people trained to recognize it. The audience recognized the intention the moment they heard it. Louis continued playing, the melody simple yet controlled. He didn't play loudly or rush. When a note lingered, he waited, and when the sound faded, he adjusted, listening to the piano and responding to it rather than forcing it to obey him. The pianist felt his confidence slip. This wasn't guessing, it was familiarity. The boy knew how to sit, how to breathe, how to let the silence between notes speak, skills that couldn't be learned by accident or in just a few lessons. Catherine felt tears rise before she understood why, recognizing the posture and stillness that came over her son when he was deeply focused, while William watched in quiet disbelief, realizing how much had unfolded beyond their sight. As the final notes faded, the room held its breath. Louis rested his hands on the keys for a moment, then lowered them into his lap, slid carefully from the bench, and stood, suddenly aware of the heavy silence around him. No one clapped right away, and his heart pounded as instinct took over. He bowed slowly and deeply, as both a musician and a prince would. The silence grew thoughtful, then applause began, spreading through the hall, not with excitement, but with respect. The pianist spoke quietly, his words carrying just enough to be heard. He admitted he had been wrong. It wasn't an apology meant for attention, but a moment of recognition. Louis remained still, unsure what came next, until Catherine reached him first, kneeling to pull him into a gentle embrace, with William's steady hand resting on his shoulder. The gala continued, but the atmosphere had changed. People spoke less about perfection and more about humility, less about reputation and more about listening. And for those who were there, the memory lasted not because a child played the piano, but because a room full of experts learned, in silence, that they had underestimated the quietest person in it. So what do you think? Do you believe Louis inherited his musical talent from Princess Diana? And have you ever surprised someone who underestimated you? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more.